When we look at the globe and see the vast variation of human culture and behavior, it can be nothing but astonishing. And I've had the privilege of experiencing that firsthand. By the time I was 16, I'd lived in 7 different countries on 3 different continents. It's safe to say that most teenagers who had a life like mine had a serious identity crisis. And when I was 16, I thought I was so sure I had it figured out. This is who I am. I'm talkative, I'm charming, stylish, African. But when I moved here to the Netherlands, that changed a little bit. When I started attending the American school, not many kids recognized me as African. You see, there weren't many kids of African descent, and it frequently frustrated me how other biracial figures, like Obama, for instance, was recognized as African and black. The first black president. I desired that. So this question of who I am or who we are is very important, and today I want to talk to you about identity and the political choices we may make out of that, also known as identity politics. So before we continue, I just would like everyone to bring a few words to mind on how they describe themselves. This can be anything, what your job is, what your racial background is, cultural background, religion, it doesn't matter. There are 3 studies that focus an ample amount of time on identity and defining that: psychology, sociology, and philosophy. In psychology, it's defined as the characteristics, qualities, and beliefs one uses to associate with themselves. It's the self-image. In sociology, there's quite a bit of overlap, but it has much more to do with how one defines himself in relation to the other. Now, in philosophy, it's a little more complicated. You see, philosophers just love to make sure everything is thought through and very well defined. So if a philosopher looked at the psychological definition, they would quickly say, well, what do characteristics, qualities, and beliefs really mean? What is the self? Is there a self? Now, some of you may be rolling your eyes already just thinking about this, so don't worry, I won't go into that much depth. But one thing that does intrigue me is which definition of identity is more accurate. Regardless of the academic ones, is your identity much closer to how you define yourself or how others define you? There always seems to be a slight discord between the two. Or perhaps is identity more of a synthesis on how you describe yourself versus how others describe you? Or does it lie between 2 opposing forces, constantly in conflict with each other? To add on to that, identity flows and changes over time. So in the end, we have this hyper-complex definition of what identity is, and we're not much further than with the first question: who are we? Chimamanda Adichie's book, Americana, explains the story of Ifemelu, a young Nigerian woman moving to America for university. There, the main character becomes painstakingly aware of her blackness. And as the novel progresses, the character starts to understand that without understanding what being white meant in America, she couldn't understand what it meant to be black. So, if everyone can just remember those first few words they used to associate themselves with, how likely is it that this is going to change over the years? Perhaps as you move from city to city or from country to country. Perhaps you said you're German and therefore you're also efficient. Perhaps you said you're Dutch and you're very blunt. Maybe you said you're a student to excuse your drinking habits on weekends. Maybe you said you're a Christian or a Muslim and you start your weekend or end your weekend in worship. Some of you may have said a feminist or a communist prepared to start a revolution, young or old, straight or gay, or any of those things in between. Our identity anchors to ourselves, and we make our decisions out of that, who we associate ourselves with, who our friends are, even where we work or what political party we vote for. But if we're completely unclear on what identity exactly is it exactly the best choice to choose our political decisions out of that? I think the notion of identity became clear to me when I moved to a part of the world where the culture was so different from me. When I was 10 years old, my family and I, we moved to the Yemen, Sana'a. And Sana'a was a beautiful country. Sana'a was a beautiful city, largely untouched by the Western world. I remember when my Yemeni guard would invite us over for Eid, the celebration after Ramadan. And as my family and I would drive through the streets of Sana'a, we'd frequently see cows hanging upside down by ropes, and proud Yemeni fathers handing over a jambia to their sons, not much older than 13 even, to kill the cow. Or we would see the mothers adjusting the hijabs of their daughters. When I played football on the streets with the kids, I would rock these really short 70s-style football shorts, and I was unashamed to show my thighs. Meanwhile, the Yemeni kids would make fun of me. But if anyone really understands on what's happening in the Yemen today, well, it's horribly sad. And to be honest, the connections I made with the children on the football pitch or my guards, I can't even assure if they're still alive. So very simply explained, when I lived there between 2005 and 2007, President Ali Abdullah Saleh served as president of the Yemen since its unification. Saleh was a longtime ally and friend of Saddam Hussein and even supported his invasion of the Kuwait. Now, what's important here is that Saleh served in a country deeply divided due to regionalism. Aside from being two different nations prior to the 90s, Yemen had a large variation of tribes, which these tribal differences were further exacerbated due to religious differences. The Houthis, which consisted of both Sunnis and Shias, opposed Saleh's presidency since the 90s. So when in 2005, after 15 years of presidency, he announced that he would no longer run, they were content and looked forward to fair democratic elections. However, by 2006, he announced that he would run again, and by 2007, he had won approximately 70% of the vote. I had just left the country. Now, this left a large part of the population dissatisfied, and as intensity grew with difficult political discussions, by the time the Arab Spring rolled around, the Houthis started resorting to more military attacks and extremified. In this picture, you can see their slogan portrayed as such: "The God is great, death to America, death to Israel, and curse on the Jews." Now, what had perhaps started as a peaceful resistance, extremified with oppression, exacerbated due to religion and weapons, and became uncritical with indoctrination. On both sides, the world was divided into good and evil and into black and white. So why am I telling you this? I think the difference between living in a peaceful country and a war-torn one is not as great as we think it is. The people inflicting those acts of violence are honestly not far too different from you and I. They have friends and families. A lot of them are well-educated. They experience love and grief. They want the best for their countries and their children. So to call one side evil would be ignoring all of the complex emotions that had led them down this rather unfortunate path. You see, the only promise that we have made in these peaceful countries is that when someone comes to power we may fundamentally disagree with, we'll verbally and peacefully protest. We'll engage into a rational discussion. And if or when we lose, we'll rethink our points so that our children can grow in peaceful societies. Perhaps even by accepting that there may be a small chance that we are wrong, that we're misled or even evil or capable of it, we can become more compassionate. What philosophy has made me consider is that perhaps identity is so complex because we're complex creatures with our own intricate habits, emotions, and behaviors. Even to judge my political choices on something as simple as the color of my skin, for instance, would not only be an insult to myself, but also to you. It would be an insult to the just identitarian movements that have existed around the world. The Martin Luther King marches, the women's suffrage movement, the end of apartheid. Yes, those movements may have been supported primarily first by the people who identified with the oppressed group, but the movements won once they got transcultural recognition that transcended the personal identities of the oppressed. Perhaps we have to consider that we shouldn't be stacking the microaggressions against us and put them against the other. What we're striving for is a society that is equal for all identities. In political philosophy, we ask ourselves this: if you could reconstruct society in any way you could, how would you? John Rawls, a political philosopher, goes one step further and says, now imagine not knowing who you are. Your race, your gender, your sexuality, your family background, friends have absolutely no ties to you. How would you then build it? Perhaps to build a society that is equal for all identities, we must shed our own in the first place. Thank you.